makes most women start a business? Is it passion, money, or freedom? Welcome to Female Founders, the podcast that takes you behind the scene with women who are founders and CEOs to help you start and scale a successful business of your own. I am your host, Nagelia de Ravin. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Female Founders. Today I am honored to have Himalaya Rao-Potlapally, the Managing Director of the BFM Fund. She is also the Co-Executive Director of Venture Partners. Himalaya is an expert in the world of venture capital with a deep commitment to diversity and inclusion. Stay tuned as I dive into her inspiring journey and the impactful work she's doing to drive positive change in the industry. Good morning, Himalaya. Oh my goodness, I love your name. I don't know what it means, but I know I'm going to steal it. It's just so beautiful. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you. Can you tell us more about your journey from getting an MBA and specialize in training venture financing to become the managing director of the BMF Fund?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thank you so much for hosting me and having me here today. I'm so excited to get into the conversation. And so one, I think I get this question a lot, right? Because most people who look like me, who come from my background, don't end up in venture capital. And so people are always like, how did you get here? And actually, even before I got my MBA, I was a social worker. And so that is like even more like, how did you go from social work to venture capital? It also feels like, have you changed ideologies when you're going from social worker to venture capital? And so I'd love to be able to just chat briefly about the journey from social work to venture capital. So I actually got my master's in social work in New York. I was working as a school social worker with schools and nonprofits. And I realized I just kept doing the same work over and over again. And it was reactionary work. And while I loved my clients, I loved everything about like the practice or the philosophy of social work in that it's like holistically minded. The practice of social work, just like any other profession, there's politics and other things that get into the mix, but the actual like the study of social work is something that I really, really love. I think what really started to tire me out was not feeling like I was doing impactful work. I was helping people, but I wasn't necessarily helping prevent the issue that they would come and see me with, right? And I was seeing that over and over again. And so that's when I started to think like, how could I be more proactive in my own change process? And I started going to nonprofits. I started doing for-profits, just trying to like understand how I could help them structure their services differently, how to run their organizations differently in hopes that that would help create a reduction in recidivism and other issues. And I ended up doing that and just like becoming a consultant, right? I didn't mean to become a consultant. I didn't even really know what that meant. I just kept helping different nonprofits and for-profits. And then someone was like, oh, you're a consultant. And so I thought, okay, yeah, I'm a consultant. I can do this. And I saw there's a consulting firm. And so I went to them and I said, hey, do you think you could hire me? I've done consulting, at other organizations. And they said, no. And they said, no, because you don't have an MBA, right? And anytime someone says like, no, because it like actually makes me feel like, okay, well, you just gave me my next step, right? Like now I know what to do and then I'll just come back to you. And so I actually went to get my MBA because I then wanted to go back and do work at consulting firms. When I went to my MBA, that's when I found out like there was a course in entrepreneurship and I took it because I was like, oh, what is this? I'm interested, right? Because I guess like from a young age, I had been an entrepreneur, right? Like I had always had a hustle and I was always selling things. Also because, when I was a social worker, I was making $32,000, right? And so like you have to be creative, right? Mm-hmm. And figure out how to like buy and trade and sell goods to be able to like, my wife and I had a catering business to be able to help make rent, right? And so you always have to figure out how to be creative, but I never thought of that as entrepreneurship. And when I went and I took this class on entrepreneurship, I realized all of my conceptions around entrepreneurship were incorrect. Because for me and my family and my culture, I remember telling my mom I wanted to start a business, and she said, "Okay, great. You go get into a good school, get a good corporate job, and then when you retire, then you start a business, right? When you're successful." And so then I grew up thinking like, okay, well, all business owners are people at the end of their career who already have a lot of money, a lot of expertise. They know what they're doing, and I don't, right? Like I have to wait until I know what I'm doing to start a business. And then when I went into entrepreneurship, like I was studying it, I realized like there's so many people, particularly in the United States, but globally as well, who are small business owners who don't know what they're doing. They're actually figuring it out as they create their business and as they run their business. And I thought, well, isn't that what I've been doing my whole life, is like starting small businesses and trying to figure it out? And so actually then my wife and I started another company while we were in our MBA program, because we were like, let's test out everything we're learning. Let's test it out on a business. And we did, and it was a lot of fun. And from there, that's when someone asked me, hey, do you want to get like venture capital money for this? Like, would you ever be interested? They weren't offering me venture capital. They just asked me like, would you ever get venture capital money? And I thought, I don't even know what that is. Is that a special type of loan? Because in my mind, I thought you have to sell something to be able to make money, right? That's the way you make money in a business, is to have a business, or you get like a bank loan if you need like some inventory or something. And they told me like, no, there's like this whole other like stream of money that you can access to accelerate your business. That being said, the person who told me that was a very incomplete picture. Now I know that, right? And I try and educate a lot of founders on like the pros and cons of using venture capital money. But for me, I didn't even know, like, I was like, okay, maybe I'll go seek venture capital, but like, how, if I go in front of investors, what do I say? Like, what are they looking for? I have no idea. I just found out about venture capital. And so I sought out, and there was within the university that I was studying at, they had an angel fund. And so I went to try and get into that angel fund to like work with them, just so that I could understand, okay, if I am working with them, then maybe I'll get like, okay, you have to look for this, you have to look for this, you have to look for that, to think like, okay, well then maybe, exactly. So that's what I did. And when I started doing that, I realized like the majority of people that I'm working alongside are all white, all come from affluent backgrounds. And the people that we're evaluating are also mostly white and affluent. And even when there are people of color that are coming to pitch, they're not being viewed in the same way, because the way that they're like coming up with their pitch or the way that they're expressing their idea isn't the way that people are used to hearing it. And I found like it was truly like a restructuring thing. It actually wasn't, the merit of the idea was no worse than an idea by like a affluent white founder, but the way you presented it and the structure around it seemed different, because they had already been indoctrinated with the ideas of how they're going to be evaluated. So then for me, I felt like this is how I can bring business and social work together. So that was my inception of how I got into venture capital and why I got into venture capital mostly, is that I felt like there's so much knowledge and access to capital that is held back from communities of color, even rural communities. When you think about like the intersection of race as well as class, there's a lot of knowledge held back. And so then when we think about innovators or like entrepreneurs who are going to change the face of tomorrow, we don't think about communities of color. We don't think about women. We don't think about rural communities, because they're not included inherently in the venture capital conversation. And so that's why I'm in this role, is because I wanted to bridge the gap to be able to help create many more small business owners and venture-backed businesses.
So do you focus more on colors and people of colors and women?
Yes, we focus on diverse entrepreneurs because we really feel like there's if you have a different lived experience from a race, gender, class perspective, and we love when we can get like, like intersectionality, right? Like, so like women of color have both like the race and gender piece when we have people who come from a different socioeconomic class. So like we love intersection of the race, gender, and class piece. We feel like if you come from a different background, and then you come to the table, inherently the pain points you're seeing growing up are going to be different. The solutions, your reality is going to be different. So then if we prioritize thinking about how to accelerate your business, inherently it's going to be different, and it's going to include different solutions than what we're already seeing over and over again.
But also, I'm guessing that's because also your background as well, because you are from a different country, so you understand how it feels, especially coming to the United States and be able to see it like anywhere you go. It's kind of like underrepresented. It's like, it's obvious. It's like, it's not something you can miss. It's just, it's in front of you. And
absolutely.
But do you feel like even yourself from another country, for example, when you're looking at me as a Black woman, and do you feel like there's a difference between the two, or how would you say when it's come to capital?
Yeah, one, I think that I wanted to like double click on what you just mentioned about me being a first generation immigrant. I think that has very, very much shaped how I feel about diversity in the United States, because my parents, so my parents and I came from a different country to the United States, but my parents have different accents. And I think because of that, even though they're really smart and actually really well, like now professionally accomplished, they're not taken seriously, right? And like they're discounted just because of the accent, right? And so I think growing up, I always felt like, okay, well, there's actually no like difference in smartness or merit or something. It's just a superficial thing. And that's what I started to see in venture capital, is like, it's just the way you present. Maybe it's the accent, maybe it's something else, that people are like, oh, well, you're not as smart. You're not capable of being a CEO. And so I think like definitely growing up as an immigrant, I felt like actually like immigrants are super smart and super resourceful and very capital efficient and able to be market responsive, because we have to be.
Yes.
And so when we think about all the qualities that make a really successful entrepreneur, those are the qualities. And those are the same things I see in communities of color. Those are the same things I see in women of color, is you have to be resourceful and you have to like be able to pivot very quickly if the market goes a different way. And you can't give up. You just have to keep going and figure out different ways to make it work. So I will say like my background definitely influences how I feel about people being included in the venture capital space. I will say like from like you and I's perspective, right? I think that we probably have similarities of being women of color. Something that I've noticed is like across cultures, when you have the intersectionality of being a woman and a person of color, there's lots of things that we can relate on that others can't. That being said, your specific cultural upbringing likely has different nuances than mine, right? And how you are received by the world, how you move in the world might be different than mine. You might have different traumas, you might have different privileges than me, right? And so I think all of that then shapes what you think are pain points and what you think are realities and what you think are solutions. And so it's really important that both of us get access to capital. But I don't think that both of us ever get equal access to capital.
That makes a lot of sense. And then but also, let's go back. Let's talk a little bit about BFM fund.
Yeah.
So I know that, like you said earlier, it's focused on diversity, right? So now, could you share some insight into your investment strategy and what criteria you look for when evaluating potential investment?
Absolutely. So we're looking specifically for Black and diverse and innovative founders, right? And the reason that we call that out is because oftentimes what I found, so I worked while I was trying to figure out venture capital, because I felt like, well, I'm so new to this. I don't come from this world. And so I always felt underprepared. And so I actually ended up working at 7 different venture funds, just trying to figure it out,
Wow.
right? Because I always felt, this is again like a woman of color thing, that I always feel like I'm told that I don't know enough. And so then I wanted to feel like, okay, I'm really, really figuring this out before I launch a fund. And so I worked at 7 funds, launching other two economic development funds. before coming to this fund. And so what I noticed from that is that even when there was a focus on diversity, which there was very, very few, it was like, let's focus on all diversity. And then what happens with that is that you're not actually intentional with the specific pain points of any one group. And so then you're not able to help move the needle along for any group when you're like, I focus on everything and anything. And so that's why we were really intentional when we thought about our demographic focus, is because we wanted to, when we think about what success looks like for us, 10 years down the road, when an investor thinks, where should I put my money? I want to think of a de-risked founder rather, who has the ability to scale a company, who has the ability to exit a company. We want them to think about Black founders first. That is our North Star. And so to do that, our fund strategy is we looked at the different pain points that Black founders in particular face when it comes to creating venture-backed startups. The first was access to capital at the seed stage. And so that is where we invest in. But the second part was Black founders don't get as much capital in subsequent rounds, and they don't get on cap tables of industry-specific leads. So those are three main issues, right? And so that's how our fund strategy solves them is, one, we invest at the seed stage, where we saw that Black founders need the most access to capital to be able to help get them started in the scaling process. The second part, though, is that we partner with industry-specific firms at the next stage after us and the 2 stages after that. And what we do is we go to them and we look for industry-specific leaders. So people who already have a track record of scaling companies, of helping them exit, they're really, really good in the industry, and they're industry-specific. So they know all the customers, they know all the buyers, they know all the supply chain vendors, right? So I go to them and I say, you already know what you're doing in edtech or fintech or healthcare. Clearly, we can see through your track record, you know what you're doing. But what you lack is, I'm looking at the companies you've helped. None of them are Black, or very few of them are Black. So let me help you get excellent Black-led companies. And so then I try to figure out, on their website, everyone says we invest in something, right? But then I work with them to try and figure out underneath, what is the revenue you need? What are the milestones you need? What are the customer numbers you need? What is the velocity growth you need? All of those specific things. And what type of business models will you invest in or won't you invest in? I figure all that out. And then I try to source that at the seed stage for Black-led companies to try and invest in them. And then I try and help them over the next 12 to 18 months get to the stage that investor needs to be able to get them on the cap table. Because what we see is, if you can get into a Series A industry-specific lead funder who's really, really good in the industry, your chances of scaling and being acquired increase so much. But nobody focuses on how do we help the intentionality of specific founders to get into the pipeline.
This is a very long process. But when you say that with the fund, with the company, so how does exactly you say that one of the criteria is being a Black, right, a person of color. So what else does it come with? Because anyone of color can start a business. That doesn't mean that it's qualified for funding, right? So
Yeah,
what is all of the criteria really that person needs to meet, that company needs to meet to be able to be qualified for funding?
Yeah, this is such a good question. And I feel like the majority of our time in the fund that's spent screening entrepreneurs is spent actually talking about this exact thing. Because a lot of people hear venture capital and think free money, or money I don't have to give back, and even money that I can get right now. And I think that there's a misconception around what venture capital should be used for, because even if you are a founder of color and have an innovative idea, venture capital actually may not be right for you. It might be better for you to pursue non-dilutive funding. So we are dilutive funding, and dilutive funding because it dilutes your ownership, right? We give you money in exchange for ownership, but there's non-dilutive financing in which you don't dilute your ownership. And so that can be like loans and credit cards where you do have to pay it back, but it can also be grants that are like industry specific or geographically specific that can help you, especially at the beginning stages. Something I tell venture founders all the time is, when you have an idea, that's not the time to go to venture capital. Because if you go to venture capital at the time when you have nothing, then maybe even if you convince someone to give you money, it's at really, really punitive or harsh terms. Because what do you have besides the idea, right? They have more of the power and you have less negotiation power. But if you can utilize other types of funding to be able to create your product, to be able to like launch it into market, to be able to get customers, now you can demonstrate traction. And you go to venture capital and you say, I've demonstrated traction in one market. I would like to now expand this to another geographical market, another customer base. I would like to like move into 2 cities or 3 cities. You're scaling the company rather than starting the company. Your position of power as a founder is much greater when you go talk to venture capitalists at that time. So it's not just about being a diverse founder. When we think about venture capital, one thing you have to think about is, what stage are you at? And are you at the stage of scaling? That is when you're going to have the best negotiation power for venture capital. And not all businesses should be scaled nationally or internationally. There are companies that are so good, that are the staple of a community, that are specifically meant for one particular demographic, and that don't need to be scaled. And I think oftentimes we're like allured by like headlines that are like, this company had $1 billion valuation. This company was sold for several $1,000,000. But if you have investors, when your company gets sold, you have to give money back to all of those investors because they own a piece of your company. And actually, in the end, right, unless you have a really, really high exit, the amount that you get back, you might have been able to get just being a small business owner, because you have steady revenue every year. You're able to employ your family. You're able to employ your community members. You're able to focus on your community. You really have to think about, in the end, will that weigh out to the same thing? The second thing is, many people create businesses to create generational assets, not just generational wealth, but generational assets to pass down to their family. If you go down the venture back route and you sell your company, you don't have those assets, right? All of that gets sold to someone else to do whatever they want with it. You don't have control over saying, well, I only want to sell to this customer. I only want the formula to be this way. Once you sell it, right? Someone can do whatever they want. So a lot of times I'm talking to founders of like, why did you want to get into this? And how do you want to run your business? And that helps determine if you should go down the small business route or if you should go down the venture back route.
Really, you really have to think the purpose behind your company first before you even decide that you wanna bring other people to own part of it.
Exactly.
But
Yeah,
also,
and most times it's not. Most times I'll say it would be better if people went down the small business route.
but also that when you give them part of the company, they have control over the company as well. Which that's where we find a lot of even big organizations end up where the founder kick out. For example, I believe Apple, Steve Jobs get kicked out at one point in Apple. So this type of things happen, like the passion, the love you put behind a company, and you just get kicked out of it.
And I think this is like a really interesting point, because one of the companies, or one of the funds that I worked at, was a Series B fund. So right now I'm working at the Series C, right? And then there's Series A, Series B, Series C. And I worked at a Series B fund, and they were investing much larger checks later in the portfolio. I actually met some of their portfolio companies. Not a single one of them had the original founder, right? And that was because actually in venture capital, you only have like 5 to 7 years to get your company to an acquirable position. And so it's not necessarily like, oh, like bad, like, the founder did something bad, the founder's not capable, so we're going to kick them out. It's more like the founder has the vision to be able to start something and maybe bring it to like $1 million, $10 million in revenue. And there's a different person who has the skill set to bring it from $10 million to $100 million in 2 years, right? And so that's like, a lot of times we get like the horror stories and sensationalized media, like this person got kicked out, that person got kicked out. Literally, venture capital is built for inorganically scaling your company's growth from year 1 to year 8 in an astronomical way so that someone sees that velocity in growth and wants to buy it. But oftentimes, that's not going to always include you as the CEO.
Wow. So now when we're talking about a BFM fund, so what is the limit? Where does the BFM fund stop? So let's say that in the funding process, what do they own percentage of it? How does that actually work with the BFM fund?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're talking about the investors into the BFM fund or the BFM fund into companies? Maybe I'll do the flow of money.
Into companies.
Okay. So because this is actually also something that I talk with a lot of investors about because they don't understand the flow of money. So when investors invest, one, as a fund manager, I'm not just investing my money, I'm investing investors' money. They pool it together in BFM, and then we're investing into companies. So if an investor invests into the BFM fund, now they own a piece of the BFM fund. Then the BFM fund invests in a company. We get a percentage of that company. And so then the investor owns a piece of that company as well, right? Through the BFM fund. And so then when the BFM fund, we invest at the seed stage, and ideally we like to invest again at the Series A stage. Sometimes people need more time, particularly in this market, to get to Series A. And so they have more, like a couple like rounds in between, and we try and support there as well. But ideally, we like to invest at the seed stage and then again at the Series A stage. And so that's what we invest in. After that, Series B, Series C, whatever, when they get acquired, at the purchase price, then we think about, okay, what is our percentage of that? We get that back. Then the investor, we say, okay, you own a percentage of the BFM fund, and we give a percentage of that money back to the investor. That's how the money flow works.
So pretty much you guys don't get involved into the company or anything like that at all?
Well, we do get involved into the company, particularly between the Series Seed and the Series A. So you know how I mentioned that I'm talking to Series A investors and I'm figuring out what will they invest in? So after we invest in the Series Seed, we're trying to work with companies for the next 12 to 18 months really closely to get them to be invested in by the Series A investor. After the Series A investor gets like involved in it, right? Then we're like, they have much more expertise in that particular industry and at that size to be able to help the company.
So now you don't get involved anymore unless it's the company's being sold or something like that.
Yeah, mostly. I will say that we're still available, but I think what the founders find is that someone else is more useful. Just like with the founders, right? Sometimes it's the founder, sometimes it's someone else that is the most useful in that stage. In venture capital, you really have to know when you're being the most useful and when you need to step back and let someone else be the person who does it.
Let somebody else handle the business. But also on top of BFM Fund, the BFM Fund, you're also a co-executive director of Venture Partners, a nonprofit organization. So can you tell us a little bit more about that nonprofit?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, we have the main venture fund, but what we realized is, especially being a social worker, I like to look at things holistically, right? Mm-hmm. And so in addition to running the venture fund, we also have two nonprofits that were our part and spun out of BFM. So the first one is Emerge, and Emerge is a founder-focused nonprofit. So we help support. For our venture fund, you already have to have some revenue to be able to show us that you can sell into your market. But a lot of times, as people of color, we don't have the money to make our product. We don't have the money to be able to we don't have the mentorship to understand how that works. So our nonprofit helps create grants and education for people of color and people from rural areas on how to become business owners. So we do a whole founder focused nonprofit that supports the on-ramp into entrepreneurship. Venture Partners, on the other side, is a funder nonprofit. So we try to figure out how can we have more representative leadership in different venture funds, and people who are writing checks, we want them to not only be diverse from a race and gender perspective, we also want them to have a different socioeconomic background. Because we find that if you have a different socioeconomic background and you're diverse, not either or, and you actually can come to the table and be more representative of the founders that are usually pitching. And that way we can have more representation of the different communities. So that's what we're trying to do. So we run a fellowship program, and we partner with the NVCA and Venture Forward, which is the National Venture Capital Association, to provide education. And so we've run 2 cohorts. We're gearing up for our 3rd cohort now. And what we really look for is how can we bring in different voices into venture capital, and how can we create more down the line, more people who run their own fund organizations that come from very, very different backgrounds, and not this usual finance, investment bank, I went to an Ivy League school background.
But now how can small businesses, startup founders get involved into something like that?
Yeah, so the Emerge nonprofit is usually the best way for us to engage with small business owners, because we're doing programs specifically for small business owners, right? I will say on the venture partner side, what we do is every time we run a cohort, those fellows are learning how to evaluate companies. And so we put out a call for any founders that want their companies evaluated in a venture capital way. And so then they get a due diligence report and they get evaluated, and they get to see okay, how would I get evaluated by an investor?
Which is really cool, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And it's free.
Yeah, it's free. And the fellows also then get to learn how to evaluate companies.
Yes, exactly. No, I think knowing the process is important, especially if you're thinking about it.
Yes, absolutely.
So before I let you go, I have one more question for you. What advice would you give to investors, particularly the one underrepresented background, who are looking to break into the world of venture capital and making a meaningful impact in their community?
Yeah, I think this is a really good ending question. I think that in my time in venture capital, I've realized, one, structurally, it hasn't been built with equity in mind. It's actually been built with exclusivity in mind, right? And it's also been built by people who are independently wealthy. So sometimes the structures of it make it really, really difficult for a person who comes from an underrepresented background and from someone without monetary privilege to be able to work in it. So I'll give you just one example as a way to for anyone who's listening who thinks I want to break into venture capital, I want to be a fund manager. Try to think about it. Try to think outside the box of how to be able to do that. Because one thing that I'll say is, and this is my own, maybe sometimes shortcomings, I felt like when I was entering venture capital, I really felt like I don't know anything about venture capital. And so I worked at so many different funds. And I will say that was really, really helpful, because then I understand the rules of the existing game. Sometimes people try and come in without knowledge of any framework of how the game is currently being played, and they were like, oh, I want to change the game. How can you change the game if you don't know how the current rules are, because if you know the current rules, you also can understand the current loopholes to be able to figure out how you can play in the space in a different way. So I think that was really helpful for me. But the one thing that I will say is I really try and help other fund managers think about creative ways to structure their fund. Currently, a traditional venture fund, a fund manager gets compensated 2 and 20. So that means 2% assets under management, and then 20% at the back end if the companies exit and all the investors get back their money. And while that sounds like, oh yeah, that's fine, it's actually really, really difficult because a fund incurs a lot of expenses. And so even for us right now, we're mostly working on equity. And so that means like we're in year 4 and I still don't have a regular salary coming in. That is really, really difficult, right? And a lot of other underrepresented fund managers, therefore, have to be working other jobs while they're fundraising, because fundraising takes a lot longer than you think it's going to take. And you won't be able to get a salary until you're done with the fundraise period. And you have to economically be able to sustain yourself unless you think outside the box and partner with another organization that can pay your salary, and you create a fund inside that organization, or you get a grant that you're able to use as your salary while you're able to do that. These are creative ways that more people who are not independently wealthy, who come from diverse backgrounds, can be in venture capital.
Well, thank you so much, Himalaya. I appreciate your specialties, and I love your story, the way you from being a social worker to do what you are doing now. But I feel like you take the passion from that into what you're doing now. That's what's make it so different than how other people seen it. And also, I think that educating people is one of the top things, and especially in people of colors, we not being educated a lot about certain things. And if we don't go out there and educate ourselves, somebody else not going to do it for us. And when we have, especially as women, when we have other women of colors that stand and say, hey, I got you. And I think that's mean a lot. And our mission might be slightly a little bit different because you focus more on funding compared to where I focus. But at the end of the day, it's still about women, and that's where I stand. That's what I love doing. I love to support other women, and I feel like if we keep paving the way, perhaps the next generation will have a better chance than us, even if we're not here to see it. But at least we know we try our best. And I thank you so much for what you are doing. Please, I know where you are. It's not a woman space, but stay where you are because you are paving a path that needs to be paved by other women.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on here and being able to have this platform, because I think it's really important for other women and women of color to hear that we are doing something so that they can also join. It's a collective vision, right? It's not about you and I, but I'm really appreciative of what you're doing as well. And I hope that other people are able to read this, hear this, and are able to be inspired to come join us.
I hope so too. That's exactly what we are doing, isn't it?
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for listening to Female Founders Podcast. That's it for this week's episode. Be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app or connect with us on womel.com so that you don't miss our next episode. See you next time. Bye for now.